Hello, everybody. Uh, what I'd like to do right now is just to talk very briefly about the fact that today's archaeology is very much problem-oriented. Uh, Certainly it was problem-oriented in the past. It's just that the kinds of questions that we're asking today about the past have changed. With respect to movements of people into the New World, the major questions, interestingly enough, the basic questions have not changed all that much. Basic questions such as when did people move into what we call the New World, and in this case the New World, maybe that for some might be a pejorative term, North America, Central and South America. Certainly it was a world that was as old as any other parts of the world, at least for some 20,000 years. When did people move into the Americas? How many migrations were there? How did they establish themselves here? How did they move from the northern parts of the Americas through the central South Americas, tip of South America, and so on? I mean, how did all this take place? Why did it take place? How many movements were there? And so the very first chapter, substantive chapter about the early Americans does focus on this particular question. I'd like to say that when I started studying this in the late 1960s, those were still our questions. And even though there were some fancy schmancy archaeologists out there who had published a great deal and had said, well, you know, it had to be at this time period and it couldn't be any earlier, the fact that, you know, like 14,000 years ago was some sort of a boundary, and we didn't have evidence of people before then, wasn't it interesting that at 4,000 years ago, people had made their way to what is now Pennsylvania? That by 10,000 years ago or so, or even earlier, they made their way to the tip of South America. I mean, given that this is not a Star Trek kind of thing where Scotty was beaming people up and down all over the place, people still have to travel. And so by the very virtue of the fact that we had something that was human remains that were present in a particular location in the Americas 14,000 years ago meant that they had to have been there before then, at least in the Americas. They had to have gotten there. They had to have traveled those particular distances. And so for many of us who were students for all of these years, this is an ongoing argument. And for us, the major point is, what does today's evidence show in terms of possible migration routes, in terms of possible migrations, numbers of migrations? We're always waiting for people to find the evidence, and it's not a case of they must have come from here, from there, because of just one little piece of evidence that we have, but we're looking for the total picture. And so this is continuing. So if I were picking up a book like this 40 years ago, I would find myself looking at basically the same questions that you're looking at today. Of course, in that time, we've begun to understand more clearly the relationship between human cultures and human environments, and certainly the ideas of systems theories that I had talked about before in the previous topic are something that we've had to address. And I find that this new way of looking at archaeological evidence, new way of asking questions, has enabled us to perhaps open our mind somewhat to the possibilities of the complexities of human behavior. Sometimes I think that our answers were so simple when it came to people about the past, was that perhaps, and I don't know that this is exactly the case, but perhaps we envisioned these early societies as being somehow simple as well. And today we find that they are indeed complex, adaptive organisms that have left a great deal of evidence which we might be able to find. Which brings me to the Custer site, because that, I think, was a place of great revelation for us in archaeology. And your book actually does box the information about the Custer site. They could consider it to be quite important. But and so everything that they write there is perfectly wonderful, except I don't think you get the sense of excitement that prevailed during the life of that particular project. It started in 1969. In 1970, there were some massive excavations, test excavations, which took place in this site in the lower Illinois River Valley. And from then on, it just became a very hot place. In its time, it was the largest archaeological project in the world. It was an interdisciplinary, not a multidisciplinary project. By interdisciplinary, I mean that there were scientists who represented many fields of study, but instead of working separately on their own individual research problems, they worked on common research problems, looking at a particular question from their perspective. So we had teams of geologists and botanists, zoologists, stone tool specialists, and others, soil specialists, who were working, snail specialists. I keep adding some more things to this, even things like snails in the soil can give us some very, very fine information about the nature of life in that soil, especially plant life. We were able to understand climate reconstructions from the different points of view and then trying to combine this information together. We had a good 9,000 years of human occupation to look at, some 30 feet of human, of layering of human remains. It used to be that we used something called a layer cake model, where we had the cake parts were the cultural parts, and then the frosting was the sterile, or the material in between, where we found nothing, and then we found cultural layers again, and then nothing. Well, it looks like more like a really big tall stack of pancakes. Depending upon who you read, there might be at least 23, 24 different individual occupations stacked on top of each other for a good 9,000 years at this site. So what a marvelous place it was to study cultural change. What a wonderful place it was to study culture as a system, to see how cultures change through time, using the perspective of the many different types of scientists in this interdisciplinary, not multidisciplinary point of view. And then, of course, there were the sources of information that cultural sources of information that in the past had been somewhat ignored, such as cultural features, which is where I came in. I studied thousands of layers of cultural features from the material that they provided in terms of plant, animal, tool material, focused on features which, if you go back to the lecture that was provided to you in the previous section, you'll be able to find out what those are, but primarily holes in the ground, many of them with evidence of fire. So I worked closely with the different types of scientists in using the archaeological features as the focal points of organizing archaeological information. So it was very exciting. What else was exciting was the fact that we had, without exaggerating, millions of pieces of information with which we had to study from different points of view, and so consequently 1 or 2 or 3 individuals in a lab were no longer sufficient for doing this type of work. And so the Coster site excavations also pioneered the development of developing huge computerized databases and also manipulating huge databases using computers. That's a separate subject all by itself, but this is certainly something that I had to do as well. So for archaeology, for us, there were no rules, there were no boundaries. I remember a case in which a professor came up to me with respect to using some sort of statistics, and he said, well, you know, you can't really use the statistics for this, but I want you to look into it and see if you can justify it anyway. And so I came up with a completely new way of applying factor analysis to the kind of information that I was working with. It was a very exciting time. It was full of charismatic individuals who came from all over the world to see what it is that we were doing in our little corner of the lower Illinois River Valley. And it was actually a privilege and a very exciting time it was a privilege to be there, and certainly a very exciting time in which to be there. Not the least of which was, of course, that I met my future husband there, who was one of the people who developed those wonderful databases, which I learned to manipulate. So have a very good afternoon, everybody, and I wish you a healthy summer so far. Keep away from those colds, and I'll be in touch soon. Take care. Bye-bye.